There Was a Country by Chinua Achebe, Part 2, The Nigeria-Biafra War. To fully comprehend some of the competent positions during the Nigeria-Biafra War, it may be useful to begin with an examination of the local and international response to Biafra. The Biafran position. Beginning with the January 15, 1966 coup d'etat through the counter-coup, staged mainly by northern Nigerian officers who murdered 185 Igbo officers, and the massacre of 30,000 Igbos and Easterners in pogroms that scattered in May 1966 and occurred over 4 months. The events of those months left millions of other future Biafrans and me feeling terrified. As we fled home to eastern Nigeria to escape all manner of atrocities that were being inflicted upon us and our families in different parts of Nigeria, we saw ourselves as victims. When we noticed that the federal government of Nigeria did not respond to our call to end the pogroms, we concluded that a government that failed to safeguard the lives of its citizens has no claim to their allegiance and must be ready to accept that the victims deserve the right to seek their safety in other ways, including secession. The Nigerian argument. Nigeria's position on Biafra, as I understand it, was hinged on the premise that if Biafra was allowed to secede, then a number of other ethnic nationalities within Nigeria would follow suit. The Nigerian government, therefore, had to block Biafra's secession to prevent the dissolution of Nigeria. The role of the Organization of African Unity. The Organization of African Unity, OAU, attempted to facilitate a number of peace meetings throughout the conflict. The umbrella body of sovereign African nations lacked credibility in this effort, in my opinion, as it harbored a strong one-Nigerian bias from the very beginning of the war. The OAU's initial attempt to bring about peace talks with meetings slated for Kampala, the capital of Uganda, in May 1968 and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, at the OAU headquarters. In July 1968, were ineffectual and quickly disintegrated into fiascos of confusion. Facing international pressure and ridicule for failing to mediate effectively between the two warring parties, the OAU's consultative committee, which was made up of diplomats from Liberia, Ghana, Niger, Ethiopia, the Congo, and Cameroon, quickly resent invitations to the heads of states of Nigeria and Biafra, Yakubu Gowon and Emeka Ojukwu, for talks in Niamey, the capital of Niger, Nigeria's northern neighbor. The summit, from what I later learned, became a case of sliding doors, with Gowon arriving and meeting with OAU principals ahead of the visit by Ojukwu. This treatment meant to avoid confrontation, created the opposite effect, and played no small part in diminishing the possible results that the first president of the Republic of Niger, Hamani Diori, was attempting to moderate. Professor Enin Joko, the chief negotiator from Biafra, gallantly attempted to salvage what was left of that Nigerian Biafran summit. He arranged a meeting with the leader of the Midwest Region Government's delegation, Chief Anthony Enahoro, that closed in an impasse. Ojukwu saw an opportunity to speak to a world audience at the next summit and agreed to attend. It was planned for August in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. He treated the gathered delegates to a speech of over 2 hours in length and made the case for Biafran independence. He pointed out the great irony of the conflict, one that most of us in Biafra were already aware of. Having spearheaded the fight for Nigerian independence, Biafrans were later driven out by the rest of Nigeria, which waged war with the secessionist republic to conserve the very sovereignty of the nation Nigeria, within whose walls Biafrans did not feel free, safe, or desired. In my opinion, Gowon's absence at these meetings was telling, because it clearly suggested that he had a different agenda. This suspicion would be confirmed by his announcement of a surge in the Nigerian offensive that will increase exponentially the numbers dying and starving to death in the coming months. Most African countries adhered to the doctrines of the Organization of African Unity, which supported Nigeria for the same reason espoused by the great powers. Allowing Biafra to secede would result in the destabilization of the entire continent. There were a few prominent nations in Africa that openly declared support for the Biafran cause for humanitarian, ethical, and moral reasons. Tanzania's Nyerere, one of the few survivors of the Cold War tussle on the continent, and a towering African statesman of the era, saw Biafra's attempts to secede through the lens of the Jews seeking a homeland following the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and elsewhere in Europe. President Julius Nyerere was the first African head of state to recognize Biafra. His statement was published by the government printer in Tanzania's capital, Dar es Salaam, on April 13, 1968. The day we heard that Tanzania had recognized Biafra was a fantastic day. I remember it vividly. I was sitting in my home with my wife. We were feeling very depressed. I don't know why. Then suddenly, somebody ran in and told us the good news. And we said, "Don't be silly," because we did not believe him. And then we heard the same news on the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, and my wife rushed up to tell me. She was so elated and said she was going to teach in Tanzania. Soon after that, the streets were filled with people dancing and singing. For the first time in months, you found dancing again, and the radio was playing Tanzanian music. People were reassured again that there was justice in the world because we were already becoming quite cynical about the outside world, saying, "Don't imagine anyone would come to your rescue. They know you're right, but it doesn't pay, so they won't do anything." We were more or less persuaded that we would have to fight on our own. Nyerere's gesture meant nothing in military or material terms, but it assured us the effect it had on us was electric. Other African leaders, Zambia's Kenneth Kaunda, Gabon's Omabongo, and Ivory Coast's Houphouët Boigny, also officially recognized Biafra. I later learned that Boigny was ideologically opposed to large African states and helped develop France's well-planned decolonization policy in West Africa during his days as a parliamentarian in Paris. Boigny could have very well convinced the sympathetic Charles de Gaulle to support Biafra in order to achieve this ideological vision. Whatever his agenda was, it was to help Godney's Ivory Coast that Ojukwu would escape after the fall of Biafra in January 1970. There were other attempts to garner recognition for secessionist Biafra beyond the African continent, including wide international ones. Those who followed our story were aware of the shared history between Biafra and several Caribbean nations, where descendants of former Igbo slaves now lived. That historical connection was employed by Biafran emissaries with some success. Biafra's diplomatic delegation led by Dr. Okechukwu Ikejiani and Mr. Chukwuma Azikiwe met with Dr. Francois Duvalier, president of Haiti, at the presidential palace in Port-au-Prince in February 1969. Following that visit, on March 22, 1969, Biafra secured the only non-African full diplomatic recognition from the Haitian people.